And I will start recording. It's a pleasure to have here our guest lecturer, Jonathan Ira Levy from the University of Chicago. And Professor Levy is an expert on economic life in America. He's an economic historian also working on the history of capitalism. He has, I will only mention John's most recent book, which is a very interesting book entitled Ages of American Capitalism, A History of the United States. If you're interested in the book, know that you have access to it through Boccoli Library only in electronic format, but it's already there, and you can use that also for your final group work if you need it, and that's it. So
excellent.
And Professor Levy is happy to take questions throughout the lecture, as we usually do in the course, also for students at home.
Great. Okay, thank you. Hello, everybody. It's nice to be here. Thanks for having me. Yeah, I mean, Professor Alfani also already gave an introduction, but I just want to say a few words about myself. I'm a historian who works on the history of economies, history of economic life, but history is my disciplinary training. It's where I come from. So I know you have different disciplinary backgrounds yourselves, but I welcome all your. I have a few moments where I'll pause and ask you if you have any questions, but at any point if you want to make a comment or ask a question, please feel free to do so. Then also I do have the chat box in front of me for those of you who are online. So if you type in a question, I should be able to see that. Okay, I wanted to start here, this slide. This is the world's first assembly line at the Ford Motor Company in 1913, just outside of Detroit. And it's the culmination of the second industrial revolution. I would argue the culmination of the industrial revolution as a whole, really. I think yesterday you talked about the first industrial revolution, the Great Divergence in terms of Europe and Britain and also China. So I'm going to pick it up from there, focusing on the United States, of course, and talk about what happens next, up through the birth of what's often called, after Antonio Gramsci, Fordism, and the second industrial revolution. Typically, the first industrial revolution speaks to textiles, steam, iron, whereas the second industrial revolution speaks to electricity, steel, and the mass production of new consumer durables like automobiles. This is Magneto. It's a part of an engine block for a car. It's what you see here. So I'm going to try to get us to this moment, flashing back to the 19th century just a little bit, and then there should be some time maybe at the end to just offer a few thoughts about the trajectory of 20th century American economic power and economic hegemony and different ways to think about that. But before I talk about the assembly line, I want to pause and just offer some general remarks on the topic of the lecture, American Capitalism in a Global Perspective. It's a big topic. I probably have too much to say here in my notes, but just a number of problems arise already in thinking about American capitalism in a global perspective. One question that often comes up in thinking about the United States economy in a global context is the United States exceptional? Exceptional, the term, the word, it's a very charged word in debates in American history. There's a vast literature on the subject. Can such an exceptionalism explain American global economic power, global economic hegemony? Certainly since 1945, if not before then. Can exceptionalism help us think about what role the United States has played in the history of globalization of the global economy? Okay, so exceptionalism, what does that mean? I mean, often, this is an academic discourse, it's also a popular discourse too. The United States is often considered a or the quintessentially capitalist economy. Its economy is particularly modern, dynamic, innovative, inventive. You can kind of take your pick of words. And that idea, or an idea like it, has always been part of kind of American self-mythology. National myth-making going back to the American Revolution of 1776. But it's also true that all nations have their own sort of self-celebrating mythologies. And across the 19th century, in terms of the United States, usually Americans celebrate the fact that they're a democratic country, or they celebrate social mobility, that America is a place of great social mobility, not so much their economy per se. And so it was only after World War II that you see this discourse of American exceptionalism, which occurred in the context of the Cold War. So the United States was particularly capitalist, particularly oriented towards free enterprise or free markets, in contrast to Soviet communism, which wasn't. And then unquestionably that idea, right, of American exceptionalism after World War II was tied to the global projection of American economic power abroad at that time. That's meant that in a lot of scholarship, historical scholarship, but also work in economics, developmental economics, since World War II, that's a long time now, if we're looking back towards World War II, often scholars will look to US economic history to find, the key to economic success, the key to modern economic growth, or the key to capitalist development. And so a whole host of arguments have been made here. I imagine a number of them will sound familiar to you because you've heard them applied to the European, especially British case in the early modern or even medieval periods. So these are arguments like the United States has a uniquely free market or free enterprise economy, a uniquely entrepreneurial economy or a uniquely entrepreneurial culture with exceptional equality of opportunity and social mobility. Or the United States has a particularly technologically innovative economy. Oftentimes this argument is made in relationship to the US system of patent rights, legal rights that protect patents and inventions. That's often tied to an argument that the United States has enjoyed market-based growth because of a liberal political system going back to the Constitution of 1789 that protects private property rights. It has inclusive institutions as opposed to extractive legal institutions, which create better incentives for market-led growth. That's often tied to another argument that the United States has, for a long time, had particularly wide and deep capital markets or a modern financial system. And that often coincides with another argument that the United States invented a uniquely efficient firm, the managerial bureaucratic corporation, which had access to those capital markets, which again explains relative American economic success. So I could kind of go on and on and on listing these arguments about just how wonderful the American economy has been in the past. And I guess I just have one sort of thought that I'd like to relate here, and that's if there's sort of one thing to know about the United States economy, historically, but also in the present. Like one thought kind of I would leave you with is that the United States, as I'm sure some of you know, is a very big place with a lot of diversity, a lot of difference. And my view, this is kind of my own disciplinary or even methodological bias, is that there's no such thing as one key or one sufficient cause of industrial revolution or economic growth, modern economic growth. History just doesn't work like that, in my opinion. Matters are always more complex. But I can say the United States has always been big enough where any explanation anyone has ever come up with for economic modernity or economic success, it happened in the United States. And if you try hard enough, you can make that argument work. China's probably another place where it's big enough where just about everything happened. You can kind of make any argument you want. Not that any argument should count, but nonetheless, you see just a great diversity of opinions about this debate. So that's the good, which I sort of maybe mentioned earlier, but it also extends to the bad and the ugly. So arguments about how the United States has always had economic vibrancy because of its tradition of democracy. But it's also true, you can find arguments which are true that emphasize that at the root of American economic wealth is the colonization and dispossession of Native American lands, as well as black slavery through the 19th century. So you can find inclusive political institutions in the United States, but you can also find in its history really coercive, extractive ones as well. Or it's true that the United States industrialized across the 19th century with a vast continental internal market that had very weak political or legal limits to trade within the North American continent. But it's also true the United States industrialized in the 19th century with a tariff. It had a protective tariff against cheaper British and European goods across the 19th century. I'll come back to that. One could rightfully emphasize America's entrepreneurial culture, and I'm going to address that in a minute here, but it's also true that the United States had the most violent and contentious labor history of any industrializing country in the 19th century and the early 20th century. This is a slide I'm going to come back to again, but no, sorry, that's Ford. We'll come back to him. I'm already out of order. This is from the Great Railroad Strike in 1877, which was the largest single prison property destroyed, death, injury, the largest, most violent labor strike in the 19th century. Okay, so the point is, if there's anything that makes the U.S. exceptional, it's that it's a big place where just about every notable process, economic process associated with economic modernity has been at work. That's true because the U.S. is so big geographically, that's part of it, but it's also true because the United States has always been open to global and transnational processes and influences, working in both directions, both coming into the United States and both also the projection of the United States outward into the world. That's true with respect to migration, both free and unfree migration, and it's also true with respect to trade in goods, the mobility of capital, and of course also with respect to culture, thinking about the impact of American consumer culture abroad across the 20th century and to this day. So you can't point to one thing, you're trying to kind of figure out how these many different things have fit together in specific contexts. And even then, kind of the where within the United States and the when matters. So I'm going to be talking about, to be really out of order, I'm going to be talking about Ford. I mean, this is Henry Ford, who was distinctively American. I'm going to talk about his entrepreneurial mindset in a minute. But it's also really important that Ford comes from Michigan and not from Mississippi. And to understand Michigan, that part of the American Midwest, it's very different from other parts of the U.S. So I think within the study of the American economic past, a move that you saw made in Pomerantz, which is to focus on regions as opposed to talking about China as a whole, that's taking place within historical scholarship on the United States as well, where the kind of the regional and the global scales become more prominent relative to the national. Now, since really the 1990s, that kind of high tide of late 20th century globalization, Americans, historians of the United States, maybe not so much about economic historians, I'm thinking more of cultural historians, political, social historians, have really not wanted to talk about the exceptional quality of the United States. They think it's ideological, they think it's unfounded in fact, and instead they wanted to focus on commonality and global processes and influences. And I think that makes sense for the reasons I've already mentioned, but I think it's probably the case that trend has gone too far. And while there's nothing wholly exceptional or unique to the United States, because there's nothing wholly or exceptionally unique to any particular country or place in the world, there are things that you could say about the U.S. economy historically that make it different than other places. And I'm going to talk about those differences, but I just want to kind of note that to understand those differences, you have to kind of put the United States within a global context. So can I get back to, okay, now we're back on track here. Since I've been speaking in kind of generalities, let me just speak a bit more concretely about precisely what I'm trying to say, thinking about the United States as different, but also, fundamentally part of a larger global and transnational history. So this, again, is the first assembly line. But the majority of workers here, although I don't think anybody really knows who these people actually were, but very likely they were European born, the vast majority, a part of the great proletariat migration of 23.5 million Central, Southern, and Eastern Europeans to the United States between 1880 and 1920, before U.S. closed immigration from Europe with the new quota system. And we know that within Henry Ford's workforce at the Ford Motor Company, there was a European ethnic hierarchy. Most of Ford's inner circle of engineers, foremen, managers were American-born Germans. The last great wave of German migration to the United States happened in the 1840s, so most of them were born in America to German parents. After World War I, most German Americans decided to call themselves just Americans. Actually, the kind of that history of German ethnicity in the United States has largely been lost. But in 1913, which is the date you see here, Ford-born workers accounted for 71% of Ford's workforce, representing no less than 22 different European nationalities. Poland, Russia, Italy, and Hungary were the largest representatives at Ford. So this is a transatlantic phenomenon, a phenomenon of transatlantic labor markets, and part of the late 19th, early 20th century era of globalization, which involved, as I'm sure you've already studied in the class, the integration of commodity and factor markets. In fact, the technology of mechanization that you see here, the assembly line, had roots in what were called disassembly lines in the Chicago stockyards in the 1870s and 1880s. And this is a photograph of a disassembly line in a Chicago meat packing plant. It's a photograph that actually comes from the archives of the Ford Motor Company. So they were studying this process of disassembly. So Chicago was an industrial city. It's a product of the growth of railroads in the United States during the 1870s. Chicago had the largest stockyard, the largest animal slaughterhouse. Railroads delivered cattle who grazed on plains from as far south as Texas up to Montana, Canada. And with the invention of the refrigerated rail car, the refrigerated steamship, in the 1880s, Chicago began to export meat to Europe. So again, the globalization of commodity markets, in this instance, meat, creating demand, and in that context, this innovation, the disassembly line. And actually, one of the reasons why in Chicago there was a need to create these new methods is that Chicago was in competition with meat packers in Buenos Aires and Argentina, who were funded by British capital for raising cattle and selling meat back to Europe. So again, it's a global phenomenon through and through. But just to go back to the labor side to talk about, again, it makes the United States look a little bit different. You know, why are there so many European immigrants to the U.S. at this time? It's because the U.S. Was a high-wage economy, high real wages relative to Europe, even if the working conditions were horrible and standing at an assembly line for 8 hours was not much fun, but nonetheless, the wage was high. And in fact, Ford famously paid a $5 a day wage. Okay, so high wages, I'll come back to that. Now, this may have been the first, this is Chicago. Sorry, I'm from Chicago, so I can't help but show photographs from Chicago. This is the Chicago River crusted over with animal waste from the stockyards, and a man is standing on top of it here. So, you know, that's what Chicago was like in 1911. But to go back here, this assembly line, you can see it's not electrified yet. It's on a line. They actually use a pulley system and gravity to keep the line moving here. But Ford would, within months, electrify the assembly line. And electricity speaks to the history of energy. That's another dimension of U.S. economic history that's really important. So it's a high-wage economy relative to the rest of the world. It's also a particularly energy-intensive economy. Always. If you think about it, those two things often tend to go together because energy intensivity is often complementary to capital intensivity. This is an argument that economic historian Robert Allen has made about the British Industrial Revolution. He's made it about America too, where I think it mostly works, but also high wages can create an incentive to employ more capital relative to labor. This pattern, we see it here, has actually been present for much of American economic history. So let me give another example that you might not think of, and that is slavery. This is shows the geographical concentration of slaves as a percentage of total population in 1860. Slaves, and slavery was very important to the early period of American economic development. Slaves were exploited labor, that's definitely the case, but it's also true that slaves were a form of capitalized labor, a form of mobile productive capital. And one reason why, until the US Civil War of 1861-1865, which abolished slavery, one economic reason behind the Southern expansion of slavery was that, much like throughout the Caribbean world, because of the climate environment, because of the disease environment, white free laborers simply would not migrate to the US South to work on sugar plantations or later cotton plantations, which were horrible places to live and work. And so Southern American planters, I think you covered the Atlantic trade in the class already, Southern planters turned already in the 17th century to black slavery. Okay, but if you stick with energy and thinking of slavery as a capital-intensive form of economic development, before the Industrial Revolution, before the rise of steam, let alone what we're going to see with Ford, electric power, the best way to amass large amounts of energy for production in one place was really through slavery, through the gang labor system of slavery. Energy here taking the kinetic form of human beings working in concert also with animals in an agricultural setting. So you saw this in Pomerantz, but before the Industrial Revolution, vegetation, whether it's providing calories or being burned for light or fuel, vegetation accounts for approximately 98% of all of the energy supply in the economy, with the other 2% coming from wind, coming from water. And that's the ghost acreage argument that Pomerantz appropriated from Alfred Crosby. And it's a natural resource bounty that's very important to American economic development, and it partly explains this capital intensivity trajectory. Okay. So here's one point to kind of step back for a second and think about why are we talking about capitalism, or why emphasize capitalism when talking about the economic history of the United States. It's true the U.S. has had relatively high wages across much of its history, not all, and that's been really important in setting its global trajectory. But it's also true the U.S. has always been a very capital and energy intensive economy. Well, and if you're going to talk about capitalism, it would seem to me that capital, emphasizing capital, would be one reason why you would want to mobilize that concept. Now, before Industrial Revolution, slavery is also one example, but it's also true that land is another form of capital. And when you see another form of capital intensivity in the U.S. economy because of the high land to labor ratio, given the colonization and expropriation of native lands. So if you take China, if I remember my Pomerantz, I haven't, you've read Pomerantz more recently than I have, but I think Pomerantz says that in China, the average peasant household maybe has 1 or 2 hectares that they're cultivating, whereas in 1800, the average, average is a pretty loose concept, but nonetheless, the average farm household in the United States in 1800 has 45 hectares. So 45 times as much land to work with as the average peasant household in China. Lots of capital and lots of energy in the form of appropriated nature. Okay, so far, American history, global through and through. Yet nonetheless, there are some distinguishing characteristics, and so far I've talked about the high wage, and also the relationship, its relationship to capital and energy intensivity. So let me now go back to Ford and just talk about the origins of the assembly line, how it happened, how it came together. I'll check the screen to make sure there's no chats, messages. There aren't. I don't see any hands, but feel free to interject whatever you like. Okay. Here's Ford again. Ford was born in 1863 on a farm outside Detroit, a city called Dearborn. His father was Irish, his mother was Belgian. A lot of the great American industrial revolutionaries, entrepreneurs, had a father who was de-skilled by industrial revolution in Britain, who then migrated to the US. Ford's one of those individuals. Andrew Carnegie was another. He was from Scotland. Ford, again, born in 1863. That's the second year of the Civil War in the United States that after 2 centuries put an end to black slavery. Just a few words on context. It's important to understand the political culture that gave rise both to anti-slavery in the United States, but also formed the backdrop to Ford's entrepreneurial mindset. This isn't the best map for the purpose, but nonetheless, it gives you some sense. I mean, the American Civil War was fought over what was called the West at that time, which is really the trans-Mississippi West. The Mississippi River runs, you can see Louisiana is way up there. St. Louis is on the Mississippi, Natchez, and of course New Orleans is on the Mississippi. The Civil War is fought over this region and whether or not it would be open to the further expansion of slavery or not. The anti-slavery Republican Party, led by Abraham Lincoln, you might have heard of him, said no, the West should be closed to slavery, and the most crucial bastion electorally, the most crucial bastion of support for Lincoln in the election of 1860, which Lincoln won and led to the outbreak of the Civil War, the crucial region was what was then called the Northwest, but today is called the Midwest. It's a region that stretches across Pennsylvania, Philadelphia is in Pennsylvania, stretches across Pennsylvania and also upstate New York State through to Michigan, Ohio, and then the capital of the Midwest, Chicago. And it's an economic region that surrounds or hugs the Great Lakes. And you can see Detroit on the map. Detroit was a fur trading outpost of the French Empire going back to the 17th century. Michigan became a state in the United States in 1837. Okay, the political mantra of the Republican Party was free soil, free labor, free men. Free soil, so the idea that all men, heads of households, as citizens of a democratic republic, were entitled to property, but especially, given the ideology of republicanism, which goes all the way back to Renaissance Italy, property in the form of land. That's land taken from Native Americans, but land, according to this argument, that the United States, for a modest price, perhaps even on credit, should make available to all free white American citizens. Again, that ideology goes back to the American Revolution and helps explain the wide distribution of property through land among white male heads of households. It also explains why the United States, circa 1800, these are very rough dates, was probably the most economically equal economy in the world that can be measured, at least reasonably. It also had the highest living standards. This, I believe, this is a school of painting in the United States called the Hudson River School. The Hudson River is in New York State. And in the 1840s, 1850s, Americans were obsessed with these landscapes, which would show this kind of vast expanse of land waiting to be conquered. The sun's always is in the west, setting, so you can kind of see the light emerging from the west. If you look on the bottom right maybe you can kind of see encroaching kind of wagons, encroaching commerce, encroaching colonization. So that's one image of the land, and this is something different. This is Piketty's numbers, but this is wealth inequality, Europe and the U.S., and you can see that relative to Europe, the U.S. is a very equal economy with respect to wealth because of the broad popular access to land. Now, I will say this should give us some pause, this statistic, because think about Professor Alfani's work. Our modern distributive sense of equality, fails to capture every possible possible dimension of human subordination, hierarchy, domination, and so forth. So in distributive terms, looking at land, the United States is very equal in 1800, but also, as I've said, it's also an economy to a large extent premised upon slavery and exploitation and extraction of labor from a subordinate group within a broader hierarchy. So, the question of equality, inequality is very complex when you go back to 1800, let alone later. Now, as for slavery, by the time of the Civil War in 1860, there are many Michigan farmers, and this is where Ford comes from, who for moral reasons were anti-slavery. But most of the reason why they joined the anti-slavery Republican Party and voted for Lincoln was the promise of free soil, the promise of cheap land, and also the promise that the government would invest in the infrastructure like railroads, roads, turnpikes, necessary to connect the Great Lakes commercially to the Northeast, and that would happen. So through, above all, the city of Chicago, through the railroads, Midwestern farm products, wheat, corn, cattle, by the 1870s, 1880s, when Ford was a boy, would cross the Atlantic through new steamships and would conquer European commodity markets and would drive, millions of European peasants off the land, and they would migrate to the United States to work in industrial factories like Ford's in Detroit. Okay, as for industry, Lincoln wins the election of 1860 because he's pro-tariff. He's pro the protective tariff to protect especially U.S. iron. There's some steel, not much, but iron and fledgling steel manufacturers from British imports. The American tariff remained in place until World War II, for the most part. That tariff won Lincoln the state of, I want to go back to the map, the state of Pennsylvania, which extends west from Philadelphia. And that's where the second industrial revolution was born in the United States, in Philadelphia in the mid-Atlantic. So if you go to the Northeast, 1840s, 1850s, you have industrial revolution in cities like Boston, states like Massachusetts. Looks more or less like what you see in Britain. It's textiles, it's powered by water, wage labor, separation of home from work. But the second industrial revolution, much more capital and energy intensive, it starts in the machine shops of Philadelphia and also the steel factories of Pittsburgh. Okay, Detroit quickly becomes an offshoot of this Pennsylvania sort of branch of the Industrial Revolution. I keep missing my slides. Yeah, I'm on sabbatical, so I'm a bit out of shape when it comes to getting my slides together for teaching. This is one of the earliest oil strikes, oil derricks. This Pennsylvania was one of the first huge anthracite coal deposits in Pennsylvania, but also oil and petroleum in Pennsylvania too. This is a picture from 1895 from Pennsylvania. Let's see what's next. This is that railroad strike, but this is the Pennsylvania destroyed engine of the Pennsylvania Railroad Corporation, which in 1870 was the largest industrial corporation in the world by employees, by capitalization, comes out of Philadelphia, connects by railroad Philadelphia to Chicago, becomes a conduit for all those commodities traveling to Europe. Now, Detroit was an offshoot of this kind of Midwestern industry, and it laps up this ideology of free soil, free labor, free men. So in the railroad industry, there were these giant continental firms like the Pennsylvania Railroad, economies of scale, great returns to scale, the birth of a kind of Weberian bureaucratic managerial corporation. But Henry Ford's world in Detroit was different. Small-scale industry, skilled labor. Detroit had a very specific industrial culture, a lot of it from German, second-generation German, highly skilled machinists. They learned by apprenticeships. It's true another staple of Lincoln's Republican Party was universal education, free education. There's been a lot of free public education, a lot of arguments made by economic historians. It's another kind of capital intensivity, sort of high human capital because of public education. That's true, but Ford, who grew up on a farm, never went to school. He once said, "I don't like books, they mess up my mind." So Ford was a machine apprentice. He learned a trade. Detroit also benefited from agglomeration, spillover, learning by doing, kind of local networks of credit, local networks of capital, sharing knowledge across this early machine industry. It's a familiar pattern, a kind of industrial district in the Marshallian sense, after Alfred Marshall, the English economist, that's connected to this kind of political culture of small property ownership, free soil, free men, free labor, which emphasized the value and dignity of labor, but also the political significance of equality and wealth ownership, equality through wealth ownership, and the equal ownership of property. Okay, within this context, by the 1890s, Detroit is home to a fledgling automobile industry. Now, as many of you will know, maybe the internal combustion engine was a German invention in the 1870s. Germany, along with the United States, being the great leader in the Second Industrial Revolution. And given the strong German influence on Detroit at that time, it's probably no coincidence that the automobile industry first really took root in Detroit. Now, Ford was a machinist in some of these early automobile shops, but they took a job for Thomas Edison's Westinghouse company, one of the first electricity generators. And Edison personally encouraged Ford to continue tinkering with building automobiles, which Ford was doing in his free time across his 30s. And Ford, we're now at about 1900, he very early decided that he wanted to build an automobile that was a mass consumer product. Until then, automobiles were kind of racing cars, a luxury item for the rich, and Ford dedicated himself to building an automobile cheap enough for a much larger segment of the market to buy. And Ford, at age 40, incorporated the Ford Motor Company in 1903. Now, in addition to this sort of Midwestern political and business culture of equality of property ownership, free soil, free labor, free men, there's also something else about Henry Ford at the level of personality that I think does have to be emphasized, which makes him American. I don't want to say exceptional, but it does make him American. And if you read Henry Ford's autobiography, which is a great read, it's called My Life and Work. It was published in 1922, which was an international bestseller. Ford was basically insane. This is a highly eccentric individual. And there's something about just the audacity of his sort of vision for the future. It's very utopian, and it's sort of unhinged. It's like this is a guy who made 20,000 automobiles in 1910, and 3 years later made 585,000 automobiles. So there's something about just his entrepreneurial imagination of the future, which is really disconnected from the past, disconnected from any understanding of tradition or the way things, or the value of the way things have been done in the past, that I think is somewhat, not specific to the United States, but maybe happens in the United States more often than other places. Europeans love to say this, but this goes back to Tocqueville. When Tocqueville comes to the United States, the absence of a feudal past, the absence of a feudal tradition makes Americans more open to the future, and oftentimes this takes a kind of entrepreneurial business content. I think this argument's often overemphasized, the kind of essentialist cultural explanation of American economic prowess, but there's something going on. You know, you could argue, actually, that it's rooted in that political culture, because widespread property ownership can make many people think that they could do something entrepreneurial, right? Because they're not in a subordinate wage earning position where they expect to be for the course of their life. So there is a kind of inequality dimension to this. It's probably not emphasized enough. Okay. Mass production. Ford announced in a 1926 encyclopedia entry, which was ghostwritten. He didn't really write. Nonetheless, it has his name. Mass production is the focusing upon a manufacturing project of the principles of power, accuracy, economy, system, continuity, and speed. So Ford was obsessed with time. And so literally when he was 12, his father gave him a pocket watch, and he would take it apart and put it back together, take it apart, put it back together. That's where he became obsessed with machines and tinkering with machines. And he was also obsessed with speed and continuous motion. Electricity is in continuous motion. Can't store electricity, unlike coal, say. And working for Edison's company as an engineer, Ford's job was to find ways to keep the current flowing until the final point of consumption. So basically what Ford and his team of engineers, who were very important, I keep saying Ford, but he had a group around him, they reorganized factory production according to the principles of clock-like precision and continuous flow. To do that, greater capital intensivity, huge factories, huge outlays of fixed capital, and then also this energy revolution, arguably really a second energy revolution, from the first industrial revolution technology of steam to the second industrial revolution technology of electricity. But then this transformation of manufacturing made work, factory work, so unbearable, and Ford was also rabidly anti-union, that to induce workers to come to work, Ford paid an incredibly high wage. So there we go, all our kind of elements coming together with Ford's assembly line. But all of this came together in really 3 short years, between 1910 and 1913. So in 1910, this is Ford speaking, when we cast our first Model T cylinder, everything in the place was done by hand, and on the floor, shovels and wheelbarrows abounded. All the work was skilled. So in 1910, Ford's automobile shop was like other machine shops at that time. The factory was made of brick and stone and also wood. It had pillars holding up the walls, supporting the ceilings. And on the floor were spread workbenches. And at each workbench, there'd be a skilled artisan who would perform specific tasks by hand, using tools, using implements. And then as they would finish one part, there'd be another set of workmen using these wheelbarrows that Ford was referring to, who would transport the part to the next workbench where another process would be done until eventually the automobile would be finished. This is not Ford, this is not an automobile factory, but just to give you a sense of, that one keeps showing up, of what a machine shop looked like, you know, before the birth of the assembly line. And you can see, well, you probably can't see much, which is the point. I mean, the clutter, right? I mean, just the sheer clutter. You can see these large spinning wheels, which are transmitting steam power. I mean, one of the reasons why you see this layout is that steam as an energy technology involved a high degree of power loss when power travels. So what you'd have to do is cluster workers or workbenches very close to the source, which would be the steam engine, and connected by cranks and shafts. You could also see just how many pillars are kind of holding up the ceilings and floors, given the use of brick and stone as the fundamental construction material. So Ford opens this new revolutionary plant in 1910, the Highland Park factory. Sorry, it says factory there. It's designed by an architect named Alfred Kahn, who was a German-born Jewish immigrant. A number of things going on here. Kahn, he patented it. Actually, I have to go back to patent law, which we mentioned earlier. It's a new technology which is steel reinforced concrete, right? So no brick, no stone, but they're putting steel pillars inside concrete beams. And when you can do that, as you see here, you can create much more open space, right? You kind of open up the factory's floor space, and you're no longer clogging up the factory floor. So that's one thing. The second thing is this new energy source, which is electrical power. Ford in 1910 had as part of the Highland Park factory, he built a new coal and gasoline-fired power station that was large enough to power half of Detroit in 1910. So it's extremely energy intensive, and we can fill in the blanks here and think about the consequences of this for what we now know as climate change, or for anthropogenic climate change. Electric power, unlike steam, has a lot less loss, right? It can travel further away from its source and still convey and maintain force. So that's two new things going on in the Highland Park factory in 1910, which is going to make the assembly line possible. The new energy source, electricity, also powered special purpose machine tools outfitted with interchangeable fixtures and gauges and jigs. So another move here to standardization and the interchangeability of parts. It's a very long American tradition here, the interchangeability of parts in manufacture that actually comes out of military production. The production of rifles and guns and other kinds of military implements in the Civil War. And that's adopted in this new manufacturing process as well. These machines, Ford had tried to use them before in his old factory, but a factory made out of brick and stone couldn't absorb the vibration. They would use the machines, the vibration, first it was very loud, second it would move the machine, like physically, and so you'd have to reset the machine before you could use it again. And one of the reasons why they turned to reinforced, sorry, I'm interested in factory architecture. One of the reasons why they turned to reinforced concrete is that it could absorb much greater force and energy, and so you don't have to keep moving the machines around, they stay in place. Now in 1911, 1912, Ford and his engineers in this new space in Highland Park, they begin to group the machines next to each other in succession. And they use a system of pulleys and levers. They use gravity at first, not electricity, to get rid of the people pushing the wheelbarrows. So they try to get everything as close together as possible, and they have what they call a time study department that times workers and to see how fast they can keep the work moving from station to station. Until in 1913, somebody, it's not clear whom, got the idea of replacing the series of workbenches with a waist-high line of pipes and conveyor chains. And so that's how we get back to this photo. On April 1st, 1913, the production of magnetos, which are the small electric generators that ignite the Model T's engine, is put on this assembly line. The foremen tell workers to perform one task. Here they're tightening a nut, push the magneto down the line. So first they push the magneto down the line, repeat the same task over and over again. Workers complained of sore backs, so they raised the line 6 inches. Some work too fast, some work too slow. So Ford said, let's move the line along with a chain using a gravity pulley system to regiment the tempo. Soon enough, it took about 8 months, but they had put the entire assembly of the Model T on a series of assembly lines powered by electricity, the tempo set by a switch. This is the final assembly line that rolled Model Ts, finished Model Ts off the line. You know, a historian really shouldn't make statements like I'm about to make, you know, because you risk sort of hyperbole, you know, but it's probably, you know, the greatest single momentary burst in productivity, you know, ever. Maybe somewhere else something happened like this, but, you know, you have to kind of search the historical record. So in these 8 months that they successfully put everything on these new lines, the production time for a single Model T, a Model T can be painted any color you like, so long as it's black, Henry Ford once said. The production time was cut from 12.5 hours to 93 minutes. So it's an 87.6% reduction of time. And of course, they know this, right? Because they're tracking it. That's part of the process. In 1913, Ford manufactured 261,000 Model Ts. It's about half of all U.S. automobile production. But the labor force, given the reduction of labor, especially skilled labor, due to mechanization, for every one worker at Ford, the automobile industry needed 7 to make the same amount of automobiles. So there's an American historian named Charles Mayer who's argued that American global supremacy has 2 big bangs, right? Two moments, right, in which you can kind of root the rise of American power. The first is the birth of the assembly line. The second is the dropping of a nuclear bomb on Hiroshima, right? 2 big bangs that signal to the world that American power is something to be reckoned with. Now, Ford really only had one problem, you know, setting the assembly line up, and that was that workers absolutely hated, you know, working on these new lines. How do we know that? Well, in 1913, every day between 1,300 and 1,400 workers just didn't show up. So about 10% of the workforce didn't show up on a given day. It's also true that Ford said to keep one worker over like a 6-month period, we have to hire 10, right? So we should assume 90% are just going to quit, and of the ones who don't quit, 10% don't show up every day. Fighting off unionization drives, in January 1914, Ford announced that the workday would be reduced from 9 to 8 hours, that he would also double workers' wages from $2.50 to $5. So this is the vaunted $5 a day work program, and pretty soon only about 16%, in a given period of time, 3 months, which is what they're measuring it, workers only miss 16% of their days. So a massive reduction in people not showing up to work and people lining up around the corner to apply for jobs at Ford. It didn't work. There's a long story here. Ford, if you want $5, you have to abstain from alcohol. You have to learn English. There's all kinds of things going on here, which I don't have time to talk about. But nonetheless, the high wage reappears here in the form of the $5 a day. And there's just one more piece of the puzzle that I do want to mention. I mean, there's a myth, and it is a myth, that Ford raised wages because he wanted his workers to be able to afford to buy his automobiles. But that can't be right, because in 1913, he only had 16,000 workers, and he was making 250,000 cars. Whoops, my microphone's not on. Hold on. Okay. But it is important to underscore that mass production was paired with the birth of mass consumption. That Ford is producing a consumer durable here. This is another aspect of the second industrial revolution, which culminated with the new production of consumer items, automobiles, certainly other durables, but also in the fields of plastics, electronics, medicines, and so forth, and so on. A lot of 19th century industrialization. Of course, there's textiles. Nonetheless, especially that kind of early phase of the second industrial revolution, those machine shops I was mentioning in Philadelphia, in Pittsburgh, and also Detroit, focused on intermediate or capital goods, part of the capital intensivity of the moment, steel ingots, railroad cars, railroad engines, which is one reason why industrialization did not at first immediately translate into benefits in terms of human welfare. I mean, economic historians debate this subject intensively. It's called the standard of living debate. But at first, right, industrialization doesn't tend to increase human welfare. It does later. But the second industrial revolution sort of culminates the broader period of industrial revolution with the production of new consumer items. And there, of course, a high-wage economy can sustain that. So maybe, Ford didn't have enough workers to buy all of his automobiles, but the general principle, I think, is important, that we're moving to a macroeconomic environment in which higher wages can maintain consumption, and consumption after the era of industrial revolution becomes a much larger percentage of expenditure in the macroeconomy, as opposed to this era of industrial revolution where investment is really driving macroeconomic growth. And so Ford and Fordism, it was part of this transformation towards mass consumption. And I'm going to come back to this point in a minute to talk about its implications for thinking about inequality across the 20th century. But I'm going to shift gears a little bit. So maybe I'll pause and take a beat and see if anybody would like to ask a question. As I continue to drop my mic. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah.
And what came to my mind is another key industrialist of 19th century United States, Henry Carnegie.
Yeah.
He was obsessed with this.
Yep.
So they were the opposite.
Yep.
They are organizing the state for the areas like the union and whatever.
Yep.
But I think also whether the story as a whole there, because Carnegie, he was born in Scotland, and I think he lived in New York.
Yep.
All his life, for the rest of his life.
Yep.
So I wonder whether you would say, for example, that the fact of being on the East Coast, being raised in the East Coast instead of this area where the yellow land was, might have brought him more at like human capital in that sense.
Yep. Yep.
Before.
Yeah, so it's an interesting contrast. I mean, first, like Ford is a really eccentric guy. And so, he never went to school, like he never went to public school, but he did take some classes as a teenager in bookkeeping and accounting, which was pretty common for kind of people like him who were learning a trade, who were being apprenticed to an industry. But at the same time, Ford was also famous for, and this is one of the reasons why, I might address this a little bit if I have time, why the Ford Motor Company ended up in a lot of trouble in the 1930s, because Ford didn't manage the company well. He was famous for firing his accountants and saying, let's have two buckets for the money coming in and another bucket for the money coming out. So he was a really strange individual. The distinction that I think actually is more significant besides just the idiosyncratic characteristics of one personality. You know, Carnegie first worked for the Pennsylvania Railroad Company, the slide I put up. He also did not go to school, formal schooling, you know, public school, and he became the protege of the chief executive of the Pennsylvania Railroad Company. His name was Tom Scott. And Tom Scott brought Carnegie into the world of financial speculation. So Carnegie actually made a lot of his money as a young man in his 30s after he left the Pennsylvania Railroad, where he was a clerk, speculating on railroad stocks and bonds in Wall Street, which took him to New York and kind of put him into a very different social world more tied to finance, tied to things like philanthropy, in which one might say the cultural capital of education, books, it was part of that world. And Carnegie, who was very insecure, he traveled to Oxford, he tried to get honorary degrees, he founded universities. This became part of his kind of mindset. Ford, because he was anti-Semite, but even if he wasn't anti-Semite, I think it'd be true, he abhors finance. He abhors speculation. He's kind of production, produce. He's got this kind of producerist mindset that's critical of New York, critical of Wall Street. There's a moment during World War I where Ford's about to go bankrupt, and all these bankers show up from New York to make him loans, and he kicks them out. He almost physically assaults somebody. So they're two different individuals, but also they're rooted in different economic circuits. Of course, Carnegie made all his money making steel. So Carnegie had a critique of financial speculation himself, and it was one of the reasons why he turned to steel production. But you're right, he always lived in New York, and he always lived in a different kind of social set. Okay. You don't have to have a question. It's okay if you don't, but take another beat. Well, there'll be some time at the end too, although I think I see a hand. Okay. All right, let me still talk about Ford, but get outside of the details of his, factories, and just think a little bit about the kind of global significance of his achievement in designing the first assembly line. So the first thing to note is that the assembly line spread. As a productive technology, it spread, and it spread fast, in part because Ford had no interest in keeping it a secret. In fact, he actively advertised and boasted of it, most famously in his autobiography, My Life and Work. There was also what became a kind of great international symbol of industrial modernity and also cultural modernism, which was the largest factory in the world ever built, the River Rouge. This is the River Rouge above, I believe, as it's being constructed in 1925. It cost $60 million to build, which at that time was an insane, outlay of capital. It took 9 years to construct. Arguably the culmination of the Industrial Revolution. I mean, it is in my view. 93 separate buildings, 93 separate factories. It has an integrated steelworks, a glass plant, a cement plant. It has its own textile mill, leather plant. It has its own hospital. It had an airport. It had 15 million square feet of factory space. That's a lot. An electric power plant capable of generating power for a city of 1 million people. And visitors came from far and wide to see the factory. And it was very, very soon, processed in the United States, but also around the world as something that was civilizational in scope. And indeed, as Ford put it in his autobiography, My Life and Work, I'm quoting him, "I invented the modern age." Well, that's a bit boastful, but nonetheless, this was his sort of self-conception. I wanted to show this. Charles Sheeler was a famous American photographer, but he also was involved in painting. And this is a landscape he made of the River Rouge from 1930. It's a conscious play on the kind of previous 19th century tradition of landscape painting in the United States, which always featured, maybe you could see, can you see here where the pointer is? There's like a one person. You see that? Yeah. And so you see here, there's one person here. The guy's there. It's a play on that. So the idea of the factory, with the Rouge being the kind of ultimate symbol of the industrial factory, as something now as basic and as fundamental to society and to the economy as nature had been in the past, right? The factory community as the new kind of essential building block of society, economy, politics, and culture. And you can also see paintings known for the smokestack, right? We think of it as pollution, blends with the clouds. Or maybe the clouds blend with the smoke. But again, the idea of the factory system as a kind of natural given fact along the lines of nature. So again, the assembly line system spread, and it spread quickly. So from virtually nothing in 1900, basically nothing in 1900, electricity powered 78% of American manufacturing by 1929, the eve of the Great Depression. Productivity growth in U.S. manufacturing in the 1920s, 5% per annum. It's a statistic you hadn't seen before and didn't see often again, although actually recent work indicates that productivity growth was even greater in the 1930s during the Depression. So Fordist methods are spreading, and they're spreading quickly, of both within the United States, and because Ford was this kind of weirdo and autocrat, really already by 1930, General Motors was a company that was overtaking Ford. It had a much more professional managerial bureaucracy. But it's also true that Ford's methods spread globally. So My Life and Work, published in 22, was an international bestseller in the interwar period. It was translated far and wide, and the assembly line method, soon known as Americanism, American methods, were widely popular in Nazi Germany, where Ford had a plant, fascist Italy, where actually Ford didn't break into. Fiat kind of warded Ford off. But also in the communist Soviet Union, where Ford set up tractor factories. And Hitler, Mussolini, Lenin, they're all great fans of Ford and Fordism and avid readers of My Life and Work. Here's a quote from Stalin. Let's see if I can read my own handwriting. American efficiency is that indomitable force which neither knows nor recognizes obstacles, which continues on and takes off once started, is never finished, even if it is only pursuing a minor task, and without which serious constructive work in the modern age is inconceivable. It is the combination of the Russian revolutionary spirit and industrial American efficiency that is the essence of Leninism and Soviet communism. There's a very rich and fascinating global history of Ford and Fordism in the interwar period, which is a period often treated as a moment of deglobalization, and quite rightly so. If one looks at trade, migration, capital mobility, it looks like deglobalization. But if you look at it in terms of the movement of productive technologies and methods, it's actually a moment of global integration, which will culminate with World War II, which is a battle between factories, essentially, which the Soviet Union and the United States won. And one of the reasons the military historians, I think is right, explain why the United States won World War II. It has a much more capital intensive economy and also army. And so the nuclear bomb, River Rouge, represented extraordinary outlay of fixed capital, but the amount of capital to build the atomic bomb was you know, I don't have the numbers at the top of my head, but they were quite extraordinary. Whereas the Axis powers, Italy, Nazi Germany, also the Japanese, they're labor-intensive armies. They squeeze labor out of soldiers, and they don't have as much energy or force brought from the capital side of their economy. Okay, Fortis production. What time did we stop again? 1:40? Okay, good. Okay, good. Excellent. So Fortis production methods, again, at the heart of the Second Industrial Revolution, at the heart of World War II, and then also at the heart of post-war industrial economies. And, you know, let me just kind of double back to a point earlier in the lecture. As I said, Fordism spreads. It takes on different characteristics in different national settings. It iterates differently depending upon the national context and the ideological context, both in the Soviet Union and the United States and across Europe and throughout Latin America and Asia. And so there, it's an interesting question. I don't really have an answer, actually. You know, is Fordism a phenomenon of capitalism? And maybe not. You know, maybe it's best interpreted as an industrial phenomenon, as a phenomenon of industrial modernity that was truly a global phenomenon that could go communist, that could go fascist, that could go capitalist. And that's where General Motors takes it. Was Ford a capitalist? I mean, he became rich, he made a lot of profit, but he hated finance, he didn't particularly care about money. They would ask him, you know, Ford, how much profit did you make last year? I don't know. You know, whatever we made, let's reinvest it in production. So it's a moment in the 20th century, and the war, of course, is the ultimate expression of this, where it's just all out industrial production. In part because it creates, to go back to this painting, a kind of new template for thinking about the basic organizing units of society and politics in addition to economy. I mentioned Charles Mayer, his kind of Big Bang Hiroshima, Big Bang Ford. He's also kind of thought of the post-war period as being dominated by a politics of productivity, right, across different industrial societies, of how to squeeze, right, more goods out of this kind of Fordist assemblage of industrial, you know, production. What's next here? Back to that. Well, this is top 10% of national income shares. I think I put the US and the UK from 1920. So now the very familiar U shape across the 20th century. Okay, so US global economic hegemony is premised upon the Fordist assembly line, capital and energy intensivity, a politics of productivity that iterates differently in national context. I guess one challenge is to think about how it matches this graph, right? I mean, this, you know, stylized, not even stylized, this fact that we know about the trajectory of economic inequality across the 20th century. You know, many arguments about the war, the destruction of capital, the destruction of physical capital, also taxation systems in terms of redistribution playing a role. But if you think about the assembly line and making the assembly line the kind of dominant unit of the economy, it's not the single explanation of this, but it does fit in, or it is part of an explanation, excuse me. I mean, Ford, as I mentioned, was rabidly anti-union. But in the end, during World War II, he's forced to relent, and Ford Motor Company does unionize. And, you know, the assembly line creates a problem for Ford, which is that if you have an assembly line, all it takes is one worker to quit, to stop working, to hold up the line, and the whole thing collapses. So I think there is something about this moment, kind of all-out production, the kind of high tide of industrial modernity, where you're putting so much capital, to go back to our capital theme, you're fixing it on the ground, that it does create a sociological and also political, if you think about taxation, political context to which it can be contested. You can contest the income that comes out of these factories, and there is a certain kind of leverage for labor, whether it's through organizing strikes or through flexing political power in the context of post-war social democracy. I mean, of course, it's an extraordinarily complex subject, but I just kind of want to throw in this one thought that if we think of post-World War II U.S. hegemony as a moment of global Fordism, that it does, I think, align with a moment of greater income equality coming out of this industrial setting. And this gets back to the point that I made earlier, comparing Ford to Carnegie, which is that Ford was committed to production for the sake of production. He had no interest in finance. He had no interest in money. He had no interest in speculation. So he had no interest in what you might think of as the kind of mobility of capital, really, to go back to the theme of capital and the history of American capitalism. So, this lecture has obviously been about Ford, the assembly line, and mass production, and the birth of mass production and mass consumption. But I guess I do want to, I'll stop so we have some time to ask for questions or just comments or anything. I do want to say that I thought about it actually. Like, you could give a completely different lecture in which you wouldn't talk about Ford and Fordism and mass production, but rather you'd talk about U.S. economic hegemony in terms of finance and the power of the dollar, right? Because I think you're up to the interwar period, and one of the things that happens in the interwar period is we see a reversal, right, of capital flows, especially in World War I, where the U.S., right, instead of importing capital, which it had from Europe across the 19th century in the context of its industrialization, now becomes an exporter of capital and now owes all these debts that Europe owes the United States coming out of World War I. Maybe you've covered this, maybe not. I mean, the U.S. is very hesitant for complex reasons to kind of seize the mantle of international financial hegemony in the interwar period. But after World War II, with Bretton Woods, the U.S. dollar does become the anchor of the global economy. That's a different trajectory, a different kind of capitalism, one could argue, that's kind of different from the Ford story, that when you see when you see those lines marching upwards again in the U-shape after 1980, like, that's the kind of U.S. economic power and U.S. economic hegemony that we still see today in this period, right? Fordism, as a productive technology, as a template for industrial society, enters crisis everywhere in the 1970s, everywhere. And different economies, different societies emerged from that crisis in different ways. It happened in the Soviet Union. Eventually, communism, fails. Social democracy meets different fates, across Europe. And the United States, we don't think of the United States anymore. Maybe some things, if you think of Silicon Valley, there's different kinds of industrial production. There's still a lot of industry in the U.S. But the U.S. today, its economic supremacy is not rooted in manufacturing power, right? Instead, it's rooted in financial power. We can see that playing out today with the war in Russia and Ukraine and the kind of sanctions that the United States is attempting to enforce upon Russia financially. So that's a far too cursory treatment. But I just want to put my finger on this point that when you're thinking about U.S. global the relationship between the U.S. economy and the global economy, you have this trajectory that comes out of manufacturing that Ford's really central, but you also have this other trajectory where Carnegie was kind of more back and forth that has to do with finance, which is more prominent today, and has some relationship to these patterns of familiar patterns of economic equality and inequality across the 20th century. Okay, so I'll stop there, leaving us a few minutes for any questions or comments that you might have. Please.
The question was about the possible connection between the end of the First World War
Yeah.
and inequality. So we know that after the First World War, in the United States, the new way of production, let's say, is a lot with respect to the hospital.
Yeah.
So this could possibly be also looking at the graphs that a way to explaining why we have exponential increasing inequalities in the United States. And if it is so, are the entrepreneurs that became richer and richer with respect to the rest of the population?
Yeah.
There are other sectors, let's say, that becomes richer because of financial development.
So the question was, if I heard you right, but tell me. The question was, the increase in economic equality after World War I, is this connected to the history? Yeah. Yes, and it's connected on two sides. I mean, one, Ford and other entrepreneurs like him across the 1920s, it's a moment of labor conflict in which American labor unions are not very powerful. And we do not see across the 1920s real wages move up, median wages move up in the United States very much at all, even as we see kind of these great fortunes amassed by entrepreneurs like Ford, who for the kind of logic I was suggesting was kind of hell-bent on keeping the wage bill down so he could reinvest as much profits as possible in the construction of ever grander factories. It's also true that inequality in the United States goes up in the 1920s because of the rise of finance. And so, again, this other story one can tell about the 1920s in the United States, which is a huge bull market centered on the New York Stock Exchange, a massive extension of credit, especially speculative credit and finance. And we know historically, I mean, I'm sure you can find other cases, but that when finance becomes a larger share of the economy, usually all things being equal, inequality tends to go up. And so that dynamic was at work in the 1920s too. So both. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Please. Yeah. Yeah. So I heard. So what was the last? I'll repeat the whole question. But what was the last point that the? Yeah. 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 So the question again, correct me if I heard you wrong, but the question was, what was the significance of the fact that so many of Ford's workers were European immigrants? Influence on the pattern of unionization or lack of unionization, or just in general the evolution of this kind of industrial pattern? So the answer was a lot, in different respects. First, you're right that the language barrier and other kinds of barriers associated with national and ethnic identity certainly prevented perhaps forms of solidarity or organizing from emerging from the factories. It's also true, however, that Ford's foremen, they learned how to say speed up in 20 different languages, because that was the only thing you were allowed to say on the line. There's a great movie many of you have seen, Charlie Chaplin's Modern Times. You know the movie? So Chaplin made a movie called Modern Times where it's a comedy where he's stuck in one of these assembly lines, stuck in one of these factories. It's made, I believe, in 36 or 37, which is an era in which film had become talkies. Like they're not silent films. But Chaplin actually made Modern Times as a silent film to say that actually in the factory no one's allowed to speak anyway. So it's true that the language barrier, things like that, made it harder to organize. But it's also true that Ford's methods were designed root and branch to prevent conversation from occurring in the factory. The second point I want to say, which is really important to understand the pattern of American industrialization. I think I said 28.5 million Central, Eastern, and Southern Europeans migrated to the United States 1880, 1920. A huge percentage came back. There's actually a great book by a historian named Tarzar called The Great Departure, I think it's called, about this phenomenon. A huge percentage came back, and most, when they went, had the idea that I'll work for a little bit, make money, and then come home. And so there's always in U.S. labor markets a high degree of churn and a high degree of turnover, and it tends to be young, single men hoping to make money and then move on. And it's one of the reasons why Ford could do what he could do, because most of his workers were like, well, I'll do this for a year, 6 months, then I'll leave. They're not imagining, oh, well, I'm going to be here for 20, 30 years, and so I want higher wages, I want health insurance, I want a pension, things of that nature. The war, changes that. The war really changes that politics. But this is also related to the inequality in the 1920s question, is that there's all kinds of very contingent reasons why there's a large supply of unskilled laborers in the U.S. who are willing, to some degree, to work in these factories under these conditions. Same was true for Carnegie's factories and steel factories in general in the late 19th century. That's an important fact about U.S. labor markets in the era of industrialization. Yeah. I think we're at time.
I think that unless there is one final pressing question, we have the time we have. And we all have these rotations in classes
Great.
So I will thank you a lot, John, for this very interesting lecture. Thank you, John.
Okay. And thank you for your attention. Oh, did you start it?
Yes.
Okay, good. Because I didn't.